Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this next event in the Terra Madre Fringe. Terra Madre Fringe being part of the global Terra Madre network of events which are taking place globally across the world. Terra Madre is the world's biggest food event. It normally takes place in Turin in person. Last time, 1.5 million people attended that. People always think that I'm exaggerating, but some of you who are watching or even on the panel have been to Terra Madre really know 1.5 million people attend, which is pretty extraordinary. Due to coronavirus, unfortunately, not everyone could go to Turin, so we have made this go online, as they say. So what we are now doing is having some really interesting talks and discussions. Trying to tease out some of the issues that we would find in Terra Madre Salone d'Augusto. And today at 3 o'clock, which we've got now, we've got Slow as an Artisan, and we've got producers here and an incredible chef, all of whom are producing in many ways foods that we would consider everyday products. So we've got a producer of meat, a producer of tea, a producer of bread, of honey, things that we all consume all of the time. But each of them are doing something really, really special with that product. So I'm going to invite them in turn to speak about that. We also have Lisa Osman, who's not actually a producer, though I think she grows quite a lot at home, but she's a chef, a member of our Chef Alliance. And she will be speaking a little bit about what often home cooks are perhaps doing and how the kind of difference in the kind of food that she advocates with slow food. It's very much an in conversation. If you look at the bottom of your screen, if you're watching this discussion, you'll see a Q&A button. If you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question at any time, then type your question in the Q&A, and what will then happen, that will come through to me, and I will then read those questions out to our panelists as well. So joining us today, we have Lizzie Dyer from Just Kidding, we have Peter Cook from Peter Cook's Bread, we have Lisa Osman from All Hallows, we have Jonathon Jones from Tregothnan Tea, we have David McDowell, who's the bee farmer, and we have Tom Oliver from Oliver's Cider and Perry. Thank you very much to each of every one of you. And Lizzie, I would like to ask you just to spend just a couple of minutes talking about the meat that most of us buy and perhaps the kind of meat that you're producing. Thank you. And if you want to put your mic on.
That was very, very much help. Sorry. Afternoon, everyone. Yes, I'm a meat producer. Red meat, I think all meat consumption at the moment is high on the agenda in terms of conversation and opinion. I think that things slightly changed during COVID in terms of more people maybe looking at buying locally and supporting local producers and maybe buying more from butchers. But I think it's fair to say that in this country, as a rule, most meat is definitely bought in our supermarkets rather than from, traditional butchers and local producers. And as such, we obviously have available to us what the supermarkets provide. And more often than not, that is pre-packed. The cuts are quite mainstream. You don't tend to get things like offal and more obscure cuts that are available to people. So I think that's sort of how I would see that most meat is consumed and bought in our country. What we do at Just Kidding, we actually have a little bit of a niche anyway, because we are producing kid meat. And by kid meat, I mean the equivalent of lamb. So we refer to a kid, and that's a young goat. And all our animals come from the dairy industry. So what we do is we work with one big goat dairy, and we take all the billy kids, so the male young goats born, and we rear them here on farm to produce a low input, sustainable red meat. The dairy industry, and this would be the same whether you were looking at cattle, sheep or goats, unfortunately, the males are a bit of a byproduct that don't have much purpose. So obviously the dairy would keep a certain number of males for breeding stock, but otherwise males don't produce milk. And so as a result, they're a sort of byproduct with little worth, I suppose. So we're trying to here show, particularly with something like goat, which isn't so readily eaten, that it is a fantastic tasty meat. But also trying to link together the idea that dairy products have a meat byproduct, And so we really need to look at the dairy industry in a much more circular way than seeing them as two separate entities. Very briefly, from a more generic farming perspective, we feel very proud to be able to farm the land where we are. So we're very much trying to be regenerative. We try and put back into the land more than we take out. And we also here on farm monitor our carbon footprint. And I would say goats lend themselves beautifully for that kind of framework as a farming business. And that's what we do.
Fantastic. Peter Cook of Peter Cook's Bread, give us each day our daily bread. It's probably the most fundamental kind of product in terms of the kind of food that most of us are eating every day. You're producing something very, very, very different to what a lot of people are eating. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about bread and the bread that you're producing.
Well, I think it's probably still the case that about 95% of the bread that's made in this country is made in a highly industrialized, mechanized way, with a bread that's made not as something I would recognize as bread, as something that's laced with all kinds of chemical enhancers, dough improvers, preservatives, etc., etc. But that percentage is falling day on day, apparently, is what everybody's saying. And an increasing amount of it has been made the way that we make our bread. So we break real bread, so long fermentation, either made with a small amount of yeast or sourdough. Bread that's made just with flour, yeast, salt, and water, and no shortcuts and no cheating, as far as I'm concerned. And I've always tried to make bread that reflects the region where we are, so Hereford and Worcestershire, formerly I was in Shropshire, and using as much local ingredients as possible, and I consider doing it the right way. So it's bread that's the fermentation, as I say, over 3 days or longer, that then produces a loaf that tastes great, which is the most important thing, but also lasts a lot longer, and people find it easier to digest because the gluten has been, even though we're using strong flour, the gluten has had time to be broken down by the fermentation, and so most 99% of the population have no trouble eating that. So yeah, that's what we do.
Fantastic. Well, I think if we have some bread, then we probably need some honey on it. So we've got David McDowell from the Bee Farmer. We had a talk on honey yesterday where one of the speakers was talking about how honey is now an ingredient in honey. I'm sure you've probably got an opinion on that, but maybe you can tell us a little bit about honey and the differences in that production and how you're producing honey, Dave.
Morning, afternoon, everyone. Good to see you all. Honey's a bit of a hot topic at the moment. There's an awful lot of it in social media and on the internet about what honey is. Honey is defined as a sugary product that's made by bees. Anything else that doesn't include a bee in the process isn't honey. And we do have quite a lot of people who shop at supermarkets. That's where they go, and on those supermarket shelves you will find lots of things labelled honey. It's a strange idea of, there's a lot of idea about adulterated honey as well. So part of the whole of my process is about defining what real honey is and showing how it's made. It's made by bees, it's made by people in an artisanal and an old-fashioned and traditional manner. You can't rush bees, you have to let them do their own thing, and part of my job really is to support them in doing that. And so by making sure they're in front of lots of food and a diverse foodscape in the landscape, they're then able to produce this marvelous product that we call honey. Once we've got that honey, it's then how you treat it after that. So the key thing is not to pasteurize it. If you want pasteurized honey, there's lots of places you can buy that, but the key part of it is unpasteurized honey contains that magic 0.5% in the honey, which is full of the amino acids, and it's full of the trace elements it collects from the flowers and proteins and what have you. It's a lot of sugar, it's water as well. But the key part of that is by not pasteurizing your honey, it means it maintains all of those things. And those are the things that are really good for your body then as well. So part of what we're trying to do is to educate people that you have to pay quite a bit for your honey, but there's an awful lot in it. And that then goes hand in hand about the landscape that the honey is produced in and who you work with to actually produce that honey.
Fascinating stuff. Jonathon Jones, MD at Tregothnan Tea down in Cornwall. I still meet people who find it surprising we produce tea in the UK, but the tea business is pretty global. Maybe you can talk a little bit about tea and also the really fascinating story of tea at Tregothnan. That would be really interesting.
Thanks, and thank you for having me on today. And it's a great honour to have received an OBE today from the Queen as part of the birthday honours. And that is for that very thing you've just talked about, Shane. So they call me the tea pioneer in the UK because the project was over 20 years ago now to put the Englishness into English tea for the first time. And I'm really a botanist by background. I trained in Edinburgh, but I love business as well. And business and botany actually go together really well. So the OBE is for services to international trade and commerce, which you might find surprising from a tea man tucked away in Cornwall.
I want to say congratulations anyway. I mean, from all of us, it's something else.
Well, for your overseas viewers, that probably needs a bit of explanation. An OBE is an officer of the British Empire, so called. So very flattered and honoured to have that. And all of us in the UK know that that means it's others' brilliant efforts. That's how you get an OBE. So I thank everyone that's helped with the journey that we've been on, that, you know, has made the first English tea. This country's been known as a nation of tea drinkers, but never actually produced any tea of its own. And that was interesting, you know, when the sort of slow food movement was really ramping up probably 25 years ago. I certainly became much more aware of it. And you begin to think that, hang on, we're supposed to be a nation of tea drinkers, but we don't actually produce any tea in the UK. And why? And the obvious thing is, well, it's too cold or whatever. And then you dig a bit deeper. So I went off and did a Nuffield scholarship, and I went to every region in the world that produces tea. And I've been back many times since, and I'm still learning. It's a massive subject. It is the world's #1 drink, and for a very good reason. We'll talk a bit about that maybe later. But it felt right to plant tea in the UK. It's a camellia. We have a condition here very much like Darjeeling, similar rainfall, same soil acidity. But all in all, we'll probably only produce about 150 acres of tea in the UK. It's tiny, tiny, tiny. So in tonnage, it won't be in triple digits. If we get beyond 20, I'll be very happy. We might get to 100, but we won't get to 1,000. The world drinks 3 million tons of tea a year. So, you know, forget volume, we cannot compete. However, the tea industry love us pretty much because we have over 20 years done a big job of education. This newspaper, for example, carries a front page story on tea every 17 days. This country is obsessed with tea. Mary Berry, by the way, has also got an award today, and she's been and filmed tea with us many times. So tea and cakes, tea and honey, tea, and, you know, we work together with you guys. And in fact, we don't just do tea. So we grow lots of lovely things. There's a huge botanical garden here. We have, as I said, about 100 acres of tea, but we have Manuka honey. We produce very tiny amounts of Manuka because that was first introduced from New Zealand here. So that makes another tea. Tea is camellia, but we also do the infusions. So we can talk about those as well. But that's very, very quick history of tea in the UK.
Fascinating. And again, congratulations on your OBE. So
Thanks.
that's wonderful. Tom Oliver from Oliver's Cider in Perry. I think there's a real resurgence coming for cider, and we see these kind of filthy fruit flavoured things appearing all over the shelves. They don't really appear to be that much connected to cider to me, but maybe you tell a little bit about the drinks business and the difference between the kind of product that you're making. Are you with us, Tom? I can't hear you. Maybe we'll come back to Tom in just a moment. So Lisa Osman of All Hallows, runs the most incredible cookery school down in Dorset, and specialises around food with a real sense of a terroir, and is an Aga cookery school. Does the most incredible food there. Lisa, how are most people in their homes cooking? I mean, the kind of food that the average person may be cooking, and how does that differ to the kind of food that you would be advocating and teaching in All Hallows?
So I have seen a change over the last year, very much more interest obviously in vegan, but now that's moving away. More people, especially during COVID, were interested in where their food came from, and whether it's just a localized thing here in Dorset. We're so lucky because we still have traditional butchers. We have butchers with even a slaughterhouse just down the road, 2 miles down the road. We have greengrocers. We have a goat farm literally 2 miles away from us. We have 2 proper bakeries, one cooking on a wood fire stove, a cheesemaker in Cranbourne, and that's all of those places that I've mentioned to you are within a 5-mile radius. So perhaps along with the Aga Cookery School, we are a niche here, and my vision is probably slightly clouded, but I feel that there has been a huge resurgence, and the only positive that's come from COVID locally is that people are actually supporting these wonderful producers firsthand. They're going to them, they're knocking on their doors, they're saying, what can we do, what can we buy from you? The local brewery at Blandford, they were inundated with people knocking on their door on the brewery shop and saying, please can we collect? You know, it's just been fantastic, that the support for independence.
Hopefully that will continue to be a silver lining.
Oh, definitely. I really feel that people have started to go back to grassroots and wanted to know where the food's coming from.
Tom, we've got you back. I was saying that the cider business seems, as a kind of a wider business, seems to be growing. We see endless bottles now appearing on the supermarket shelves. Invariably, they seem to be sweetened and raspberry flavoured. Nothing like the kind of quality product that you're producing. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about those. I say that and he's left me again. So we will get him back. He will answer that question. We've asked it twice. We'll ask it one more time. What I would like to do is, whilst we take some questions from the audience when they're coming in, is I'm really interested in how the kind of food that we choose to produce, or the kind of food that we choose to cook, how that impacts on our wider landscape, because all of us on this panel are producing in a particular area, and there's a sense of terroir around that. And if we were to go to France, if we were indeed in Turin at the moment, there would be a great pride in that. But I think here in the UK, we sometimes think a little bit less about the impact on our food choices. And Lizzie, I'll just start with you, simply because you're first on my screen. I mean, what does it mean for? I mean, I believe you're in Berkshire, aren't you? From memory, you're.
I'm Cotswolds.
Cotswolds, forgive me.
No, very close.
But it's a green and pleasant land there, and it is a green and pleasant land simply because of people like yourselves producing. I mean, what does it mean to have livestock on the land?
Well, I think, to be honest, it goes hand in hand with our British countryside. I think if our farmland and our green spaces were devoid of livestock in the future, it would be a huge loss. But equally, not just for us as those that enjoy the countryside, but environmentally as well. You know, it's very important to see, you know, whether it be vast, farmland or our own sort of back gardens, they're all ecosystems. And within the ecosystems, everything is very finely tuned. And it's so important to remember the knock-on effect that certain things can have. So for us, for instance, we use our billy kids to do something called conservation grazing. So close to us, there's an area of land that is called, in our terms, would be an SSI. So it's an area of specific interest. In this case, it's actually anthills. But they're trying to rewild and bring, I think you want to do the cider thing while we're back in, or?
Yes, Tom, do you want to tell us a little bit about the cider that you produce? And
I do, and I'll make it very brief before the internet shuts me down again. been very lucky over the years to have had the support of Slow Food in terms of the perry that we make, and we very much feel that we were talking about products that are in everyday use and everything, and nothing would please me more if we moved into the position where perry was in everyday consumption. But at the moment it isn't. I think generally in the UK and actually around the world, you will see cider, which is the better known twin of perry, generally being consumed to a larger extent now. Perry will always remain the slightly curious drink that is made in a small part of the UK for the most part, that very few people know about. But for those who know about it and are enlightened, it's very much a drink that people treasure. It's a drink that exhibits a lot of the great things about food and drink. Strong terroir, being that the trees are generally grown only in the area of the Three Counties and the Welsh Marches. It is a drink that's had a checkered history, but it has some glorious attributes, and it is something that through time we've definitely benefited from a good strong association with Slow Food.
Fantastic. And we now increasingly see this thing called Pear Cider on the shelves, don't we?
You do, and for some it's an absolute delight, and then for those of us who really enjoy true perry, it's something of a slight question mark. We're not too sure what pear cider is. So perry, I will suggest, is made from true perry pears, and perry pears differ from eating pears in the same way that cider apples differ from eating apples. They've got tannins for astringency, bitterness, and some lovely phenolic characteristics, some nice acidity from mainly citric acid, and then some lovely fermentable sugars and some unfermentable sugars, and all these things go to create the drink that perry is.
It's really, really interesting. Thank you, Tom. Jonathon, I know your area well. I grew up down in Cornwall, so it's great to have a Cornish business on the panel. What's the kind of impact on the Cornish landscape from your activities? I mean, you're obviously doing really interesting things. Food and farming affects the landscape. It is the landscape. What's the benefit to the way that you're producing in Cornwall? And Tom,
yeah, it's a huge impact. So hopefully all positive. We make mistakes, of course, but we're very conscious that Cornwall has a huge introduced flora. Probably, well, without question, the largest introduced flora in the UK is actually centered in Cornwall. So we are very conscious that tea is not a native crop, but it is the most consumed beverage in the world and is entirely imported, apart from what we produce here on the estate in Cornwall. So although the estate, Tregothnan, is the largest in Cornwall, the tea is such a tiny part of that, and it's centered on a microclimate around the River Fal, which is an 18-meter deep sea creek, 6 miles inland, which allows us to have these completely Darjeeling-like conditions. And just a mile away, you don't have that. So you talk about terroir, but it really is incredibly small area that we've succeeded in producing really good quality tea. So we don't see our impact in producing tea in the UK being extensive. It's going to be very focused and complementary to the environment that one family who've owned Tregothnan since 1335, that's almost 700 years, they've managed this environment very carefully, you know, long before awareness of organics, etc., came about. But now there's a new consciousness and a new awareness and interest in how all of these things work together, hence the bees. We call it the bees, trees and teas, and how they all work together, and they are totally interdependent, as we are with nature. So we try and be complementary to nature in everything we do, but, you know, we make mistakes as well. But our ambition is that what we leave is a legacy better than what the family have inherited after, as I say, almost 7 centuries. So that's a pretty tough call.
Absolutely extraordinary. Lisa, as consumers, are we able to maintain our local environment and enhance our local environment by how we shop and how we cook?
Oh, definitely, because when you're buying from somebody who's produced the food, I feel like I'm preaching to the converted, but when you're buying from for example, we've got a fantastic chocolate maker, Solkiki in Dorset, and okay, I appreciate they're importing the beans, but they're importing them directly from the farmers. They have Zoom meetings just like we are now to buy their beans, and then yes, we've got to look at the transporting impact, but then they're being ground, they're being processed here in Dorset. They've won countless awards, and they taste absolutely fantastic. The chocolate is a food in itself. So that's actually putting shoes on their children's feet. It's giving them a roof over their heads and putting food in their bellies. Now, if that's not an impact, I don't know what is.
Absolutely. And Peter, similarly, I mean, we're speaking about the impact on the wider environment, and obviously you're taking an agricultural product, it turns into flour, that's going to have an impact. But also, actually, the way that we're producing food, the way that you produce bread is going to be very, very labor intensive, isn't it? So you're also going to be employing more people. That's also going to have a positive impact on rural communities, on ensuring that, you know, there are young people going to the local schools, that the post office and things survive. What would your view be on that?
Yeah, we employ about 18, 19 people now, including bakery staff and delivery drivers. So, and it's grown from my business is now 6 years old, and it started with just the two of us. So, grown a fair bit in the last 6 years. Yeah, it's great to be able to, you know, the effort and the money that's come into the economy, I suppose, as a result of our business being there. I haven't sat and worked it out, but it must be substantial. And then the bread that we supply to because we're just a wholesale bakery, so the bread that we supply to our customers, so whether it be the local village shop, the restaurant, the cafe, the deli, the farm shop, all of those people, it's all hopefully helping to build their businesses as well. I mean, as I said before, we've always tried to reflect as well our local environment, and I've always been one for collaborating. So I've used Tom's Cider and Perry in Hallows. I've used the beer from the brewery down the road. We're going to, it's not quite on the OBE level, but my loaf that I've just developed was chosen last week as Britain's best loaf by the British Baker magazine judges, and it is a wild hop and barley sourdough loaf. So thinking of local produce, where our bakery is in the middle of the hop fields of Herefordshire. So, and I was trying to work out how we can incorporate hops into bread, which I managed to do by creating a hop sourdough starter, and then used as well the waste spent grains from the local brewery soaked in the beer, and added that into the bread. So we've managed to make a very niche loaf, which has now attracted national coverage. Very much along, you know, as a slow food supporter and been involved in slow food for a long time, that's kind of channeled everything slow food about a loaf, which has now become Britain's best loaf. So we're very pleased about that. But yeah, so reflecting the local economy, bringing attention onto the local landscape and the local foods is what we're all about.
I'm just sitting here, I could just feel my face just smiling and smiling as you were saying it. And I'm sure the difference between these Zoom calls, for those of you that are watching, is that we actually can't see anyone who's actually watching. So normally in Zoom, you can see this. So, but I know simply with my reaction listening to you speaking, that everyone at home is just smiling, hearing that story, and congratulations on that loaf. Dave, I mean, there's probably more discussion now about pollinators than there perhaps has been in recent times. We are now talking about bees, we're talking about hoverflies and other pollinators, but those pollinators are really, really important in terms of added value to the wider countryside and to growing crops. Do you want to speak a little bit about that? And I'm also really interested in how you collaborate, because Peter was just talking about how he collaborates with the local producers. I know that you also collaborate quite a lot with other slow food supporters in your area as well. Maybe you could touch on that. You need to unmute if that's possible. Yep.
Let's start with the collaboration element of it, because it follows on directly from what Peter was saying. Honey's quite a unique product, so you can use it in lots of different things. So we've had a bit of talk to the local brewery manufacturers. There's lots of them around here, these local breweries. They're really interested in it, although none of them have actually got to a beer for market yet, although we've had a lot of tastings, which has been really good. Planet Leicester Bakers in Leicester, they've been using the honey in there. They're using very sort of international or European styles of bread rather than supermarket styles of bread, if you are, or something that's more normal to us. So lots of breads with deep rye in it and things like that. And then Gelato Village, which you can't say Italian ice cream because it gets Antonio really upset about it. So it's real gelato, and they use it in their products. And they're when they went to a couple of years ago, they won a prize for their honey infused gelato, which is called Be Happy, and it had lemon and sage in it, and it's one of their staples on their portfolio, and now in their shop in Leicester. So we do a lot of that sort of thing, but on a more farming level, we work a lot with the local farmers. They're really keen to have bees on the land. You know, they're all very switched on to the importance of it. But we've got quite a few of them who do things, take it to an extra level. So they're interested in top fruit and soft fruit. So they'll be interested in berries, strawberries, pumpkins. They're getting into sunflowers as well. But all these things, whilst they're products for themselves, they need bees to actually pollinate them. And let's say bees, and use that as a metaphor for all pollinators, because there's lots of them. And what we're finding is more and more that the farming community are putting more and more space aside for pollinators, recognizing the value that those things have. And a lot of that has come around from the lots of information that's going around in the news media about it, and the way farming is changing or has changed. So the pollinator banks are now, flowers have been put down as pollinator banks, but those contain beetles. Beetles eat the bugs that eat the plants. So there's a slow change going on about the way farming is conducted, which has a benefit for pollinators. So that's nothing to do with what's sprayed on them. It's simply growing plants that attract insects. And if you build it, they will come. And that matters if you do it on a large scale where you're planting 6-meter extensions around your fields, or you put a pot of lavender in your back garden or on your window shelf. Any of those things will create an environment for insects to thrive. So back gardens are important as the fields are important. And I find in the education work I do with schools, there's a wide knowledge of it. There's an acceptance it's a good idea, but then it doesn't necessarily, especially with bees, they then connect it very much with food, because bees make honey and you can eat the honey. And they do like that idea that because I sell mine very locally, I'm very much within a 20-mile radius of where I live is where I sell my things. You do get put the kids at schools pointing at me and go, there's the bee farmer. And they connect the man with the product. And we've got lots of converted people who the kids won't eat food for one reason or other, because kids are contrary. And then they decide it's the bee farmer's honey, I like his honey. And therefore it gives the parents a key to get them to start looking at different foods that the kids hitherto wouldn't touch.
So, really interesting. We've got a comment in, and that comes from Emily, who was also saying she was also really smiling. If any of you watching have any questions, then please do send your questions in and I will give them to the panel. Many of us on the panel are producing food, or we are creating food, which some would say is actually more expensive. It's coming at a premium price. And certainly in the work that Slow Food does, one of the things we often get labelled to us is actually this is actually quite expensive. I would generally say that actually, you know, the cheap food is very expensive. But I'm really interested in the panel's view. Lisa, what's your view on this, particularly as someone who cooks and works with people who cook?
Yes, it's something that I'm afraid we're labelled with quite often, aren't we? But there's a cost to everything. Look at the cost of an animal that's given its life, and if every part of that animal isn't used, what's the cost of that waste? So I think we can easily be labelled as a dinner party group and all of these things, because sometimes people come out with these suggestions because they don't understand it. A lot of us keep talking about education, but in some ways I think we need to drop the education, because that sounds like we're lecturing, and start talking about and start inspiring and encouraging people to look at different cuts of meat, look at where the meat's coming from, look at pulses for an alternative. The Meat-Free Mondays was a great slogan at one stage, but there's a cost. There is a cost to everything. There's a cost to our health. If we're not eating food that is produced cleanly and fairly, then there's a cost to our health. So what's the repercussions of that?
Tom, your thoughts? Inexpensive cider, is it cheap and nasty, or is it just low cost? You need to unmute.
As with many things, there's everything under the sun, but the general realities of production are that unless you're making enough to survive and to make a profit, then you aren't going to survive and you're not going to be sustainable. So for me, a lot of the sustainability argument is tied up in, a financial sustainability as well. And it is really important that products are priced correctly. And a lot of the time this needs to reflect. And when it comes to Perry pears, you're talking about something that will need to be put into the ground as a tree already. So you've had the cost, the nursery cost, or the budding and grafting cost of that. Then you need to bring it on in the nursery. You then need to plant it out. And then for a traditional tall tree, you need to spend 10 years waiting for it to fruit. The payoff is, of course, once it's established and stays established, it might be around for a couple of 100 years. But it does mean that you then have to look at the whole cost structure of your raw material, and you need to value it. So if you're going to make a drink that's going to have a high juice content and have all the qualities that you would expect from a really well-made drink, it's not going to be cheap, and it shouldn't be cheap. And you should be very happy, I think, to pay for a quality drink. The idea being that you should maybe drink a little bit less, but drink better. And the same thing with food, eat less, eat better. And I think everyone will have seen lots of calculations that show that in actual fact, well-grown and good food produced and consumed sensibly is actually cheaper in the long run. And the health benefits, I think, are well, I don't think we haven't really looked into that in anywhere near enough depth.
Absolutely. Leading on to that, we've had a question in from David, which kind of which touches onto this as well. I'm going to ask you, Jonathon, which says that have any of you really been thinking about true cost accounting, transparency labeling, to say why the product costs more? Would that be a sensible thing to do? Not necessarily in your own individual product, but in the quality food arena. If you want to take that, Jonathon.
I think that shows big potential. I think beyond labeling, though, I think that the other panelists have made this point really well, that we mustn't patronize or just be constantly educating. But I think obviously we know that is essential, but exciting and incentivizing and inspiring, I'm really keen on this. And I think what we hope to do is get more people into the tea factory, into the tea gardens, and see for themselves, actually feel and experience it like we do. When we're working in our businesses, we know it. We know that if only our customers could experience what we do, we wouldn't even be having that debate. Let's get them in and experience it for themselves. I think that's the start. And for us, it's slightly different because we were told it would never work at the outset, like probably most panelists were as well. But, actually we're such an affordable luxury. If I ask most of you how much you spend on a cup of tea in the UK or anywhere in Europe, most people haven't got a clue. I'm talking of the average consumer, but even quite sophisticated foodies as well. And then if I say to you, I need to charge 20 pence per serving, you wouldn't be shocked, but that's 10 times more than the average price of a cup of tea. But what's wrong with charging 20p a serving? And I think we just need to approach it in a different way. And I'm not saying we have all the answers, but I think labelling will play a part, and probably there's a lot to tease out of that. But I think we can do much more around it to excite and bring people on board by, you know, making them understand that it is our health. It is about eating probably better, or drinking better in our case, and you know, celebrating what's so good about doing that. And it's not about being pompous or pious. It's about having fun and feeling good about it.
Really interesting. Lizzie, the same question to you around labeling. I mean, you're obviously taking a byproduct, you know, in some ways would be considered a worthless product. I think it has great value, and you clearly think it has great value. I mean, I grew up in dairy country, but with cattle and calves, and I saw farmers using bolt guns because bullets are more expensive than bolts, because the value of those animals is literally zero. It costs more to take them to the abattoir than the value. Now you're taking something which some people would argue has no value and turning that into a premium product. You're obviously investing huge amounts in producing that and producing an ultra, you know, high quality product. Is labeling something that that's really important to you and your sector and the kind of work that you're doing?
Yeah, I mean, labeling is massively important, because if you aren't selling directly in person to your customer, your label is often the, you know, where the consumer gets their information from. Unfortunately, there's a huge amount of mistrust and bigotry. It's just, labeling has lost its value, unfortunately, from supermarkets producing fake farms and putting, you know, labels on meats insinuating that it's come from a particular farm or farmer that doesn't even exist, to also people being a little bit flexible with their terminology and how that terminology gets used and interpreted. Labeling is essential, but it does need to be simple and very, very honest and upfront. The problem is, when we talk about value, is that, you know, often, and you know, we've been called out and other people have brought this up about sort of, you know, products being more expensive, and you get into a very difficult situation with people of, you know, what their budget is. But I think a bit like, you know, people have said earlier, you know, like Jonathon said, with the value of, when you work it down to, you know, the cost per cup or the cost per serving. And we often say that, you know, when you look at a joint of meat that may on the face of it seem very expensive, when you actually break it down to how many meals or how many people can be fed from that, it's much, much cheaper. And, you know, if you then compare it to, you know, a takeaway coffee and a muffin that, you know, sometimes we all want mid-morning, you can see that actually wholesome food is actually very, very cheap in this country. And I think the other difficulty is when we look at sort of slow food, or I'm going to say better produced, don't shoot me down, but better produced food seemingly being more expensive. It's actually just because our whole industry is distorted and we don't know the true value of food. And when you look at something like meat, which is a mainstream product, that, you know, and you take lamb, for instance, which is something that we grow very well in this country, it is a subsidized product. You know, most farmers that produce lamb in this country do not make money from the product they sell. They actually, their income has come from subsidy. And the problem is with that is that the value and cost of food is not truly reflected through. And then when other producers or the slow food market comes in, they're seen and compared in a very, it's just not a fair way of comparing. And so I think that's the problem, is that there's a lot of confusion in general around it, and it's just not as clear cut of what things truly cost to produce and taking the whole impact of the cost.
We've had another question in, which I'm going to give to Dave, the bee farmer, from Emily's, talking about how inspiring you've all been. Have you inspired anyone else to become a beekeeper? I think I'm listening to this, I've invariably wanted to be a baker, a cider maker, a tea grower, and so forth today, I think. But is your work inspiring people? I also know you work in schools as well. Maybe you can tease that out.
Sure. Well, part of the reason I'm part of the slow food is because I got inspired by Gelato Village to actually get involved with it. I didn't understand in all my time eating food and growing bees and selling honey, that it had a label, and that label was slow food, and I buy into it very strongly. Yes, mate. But part of that thing, if you go to any venue and you say, here's a pot of honey, people want to know about it. And it's not that education thing is ever so easy in my world, because people want to know as opposed to me having to tell them. So we do quite a lot of work in schools. We have a school for bees program, so they have hives in the schools. We also do foundation courses to teach people beekeeping. Did about 50 people last year. So there was 50 more beekeepers in the world last year than there was this year. And each one of those has several hives. Each of those people are not just keeping bees, they're actually looking after the environment, they're buying into all those ecological positives as they go along. And each one of those people is inspiring other people. So the ripples go outwards quite readily. And I like to be that catalyst in the middle, because I initially thought that I would have a lot of beehives and therefore save the planet a beehive at a time, if you will. But when I got to about 300 hives, I realized it was unsustainable. There was no way I could keep doing that. So people were asking me at the same time, could they have some training? So I said, yes, of course you can. So now my pool, if you will, is all those other people's hives. So now we've got many people keeping hives, and some of those have gone on to be, they're looking at doing it in a professional level. You know, they're moving up from simply a couple of hives at the bottom of the garden with their chickens and what have you, living the good life. And some of those are now moving up into that area where they want to do it on a sort of semi-commercial area. And because I've infected them with my way of doing things, those people are now becoming potential suppliers to me, because I know how they're producing their honey, to do it to my standard, and then we can sell it on in a greater way. And then it's a crazy figure, but something like 14% of all the honey that's produced in this country is produced by UK beekeepers. So all your other honey comes from somewhere else. Now there's a whole spectrum of honey available, right from your, £1.50 for 340 grams, 3/4 of a pound, right up to Manuka at £40 for the same jar. And each one of those has its place, and people that want to buy into that, either because their budgets will stretch to it, or they have some purchase on it. And it was a nice idea said earlier about it being an affordable luxury. You can buy the bee farmer's honey, some quality honey, and you can have that every now and then where you might not have it otherwise. So you do find that people want to, I think a lot of it's come as well in this recent lockdown we've been having. People have been interested in food and where it's coming from, have had time to think about where it's coming from. And then from that, because they're not spending it on going out, they're actually spending it on food that's coming into the house. So they're buying local. There's always a queue at the butchers. The amount of honey I sell, although I lost a couple of customers because they shut down, my number of jars of honey I sell has actually gone up, because those customers that are still open, people are buying, and they want to buy some of that affordable luxury. They have that little bit of extra money to spend. There are a portion of people who will never ever buy into what we're talking about. There's a local town to me, not very far away, where I can't sell my honey at all because they buy their honey at the local discount supermarkets. So they're not interested in what we do. But there's an awful lot of other people who are interested in it and are led by all this idea that we want to point at the bloke who makes our honey. We want to see the cows in the field, and we understand their food on legs, and we want to know they've had a good life and they're going to end up on our plate, and we can be very happy that it's been locally produced. Food air miles, that's a big thing for me. I try to do everything starting from my little place in Ashby-le-Zouch and work outwards to get everything that I need. And sometimes you have to go quite a long way. Other times it's surprising who you can find right on your doorstep.
Fantastic. Peter, I mean, if the artisan sector, I don't really like the word artisan, but we all know what we mean by using that term, which is why we're using that term today. The craft sector, the quality sector, whatever, the real sector, the slow food sector, is to grow. We probably need more skills, and we know that we've got a real shortage of apprentices and things out there. how important is this to you? And I know that you, again, you're really interested in education and training. How important is this to you, and also to the wider slow food businesses and quality food businesses out there?
Well, it's very important. I need people who want to come and work in the bakery, and I need people who don't necessarily come to me with the skills already, but who are willing to learn, have a passion for bread and what we do, and want to learn. So it is hard to find people. I think, especially in a rural location like we are, we've tried to address that. Well, that is one of the reasons why we tried to address it by changing our shift pattern. So I don't work the traditional baker's hours of getting up at stupid o'clock in the morning and finishing at sort of 9-10 o'clock anymore. I did do that for 20 years until my wife pestered me and said there's got to be a better way of doing this, and there is. So I now work from 2 o'clock in the afternoon till 10 o'clock in the evening, and then because we're wholesale, all our bread has to go somewhere to be sold, so it can then be on the road at 7 o'clock in the morning to go where it's got to go. So that's given me a better quality of life, extended my baking life for a few more years, I would imagine. But also then that's something I can sell to people who want to come and work in the bakery. Is you're not going to have to lose your entire family life, quality of life, social life to your baking. You don't have to be that much of an idiot or a nutter or have that much of a passion. But yeah, it's the other answer, of course, is to look after the people we do employ already, so we don't get a tremendous churn of people. We pay our people a fair wage. We make sure they get the holidays they want, and treat them well. Give them what they need to survive and thrive, rather than trying to rip them off and bleed them dry. I just being able to enthuse people. So going on, doing demonstrations, having people to the bakery. We run bread making courses on average about once a month in the bakery, and a lot of the people who are my customers will come to me and say, is there anything we can do? Have you got any kind of job in the bakery that I could come and get involved with? Because they've got that passion for bread. You teach them a few things and they're off and they love it. And they're either then come and work for us, or they are baking their own bread at home, which is great too, because no one very few people bake all their bread at home that they consume. So they might come when they fancy a weekend off, they'll come to me and they'll buy bread from us. So yeah, it is a big problem as the industry in a whole, but I think it's less of a problem maybe for small artisan businesses like ourselves, who don't have a problem enthusing people about their product, and people want to know more and get involved.
That's a really fantastic way to wrap up this session. We're just about to come to an end. I wanted to thank all 6 of you. It's just been really, really fascinating. I think we've all learnt that there is no such thing as cheap food, that there is a cost to everything, and actually it's about a fair price which reflects what that food and drink represents. And our food and our drink, and the food and drink that we purchase and cook at home, directly impacts on our local communities. It directly impacts on our landscape. It means whether or not, as I say, our village school is open, our post office is open, and the wider countryside looks as it does. We have a huge number of other events taking place across the weekend. Later today, we have a talk on biodiversity. We have actually a cider tasting at 6 o'clock. We also have conversations on things such as the Scottish Arca Taste. Over the rest of the weekend, we have debates and lectures on everything from the history of the peppercorn through to cheese tastings. And over the weekend, we've had people speaking such as Tracy Worcester, Patrick Holden, parliamentarians, and as I say, artisans across the UK, as we have on this panel. On behalf of everyone watching, thank you so much for giving your time today. I've listed everyone's businesses in the chat box. Have a look at the Terra Madre Fringe website. You'll find everyone there. Many of the businesses have an online shop. Please go and support these businesses and others. And as I say, we can maintain our green and pleasant land both here and elsewhere. Thank you very much, everyone, and I hope to see you at another event at this Terra Madre Fringe. And thank you very much to our panelists.